Some stories don't begin with screams or blaring alarms. They begin with silence. A very particular kind of silence so cold it makes your heart tighten. You can imagine an ordinary afternoon. You come home after a long day of work, open the door, expecting to see your child laughing or sleeping. But instead, you step into a room that is completely still. The bottle is untouched. The toys are exactly where they should be. The crib is still open, and the child is no longer there. The first question is never who took my baby. The first question is always, did I see it wrong? Could she be hiding somewhere? Did I miss something tiny that I should have noticed? But as the seconds pass, as each breath tightens in your chest, you understand that this silence isn't random. It is absence. It is loss. It is the nightmare no parent on earth ever wants to face. This isn't a story of violent crime, nor a dramatic disappearance filled with clues like in the movies. This is the story of an ordinary family in Texas, in an ordinary city, on an ordinary day, and an extraordinary moment that shattered their lives in an instant. A moment the mother would later say could have been changed if she had come home just 5 minutes earlier. This story stretches over more than 5 decades. Longer than the careers of the investigators who once held its case file. Longer than the miles this family walked trying to recover a truth that seemed buried by time. But time cannot kill love. Pain cannot stop them. And hope, even when reduced to the faintest glimmer, remains. Always remains. The journey you're about to hear is not just a case. It is the story of a mother who never let go. A father who refused to believe his daughter was gone forever. A family who carried their pain like a scar, living with it, growing with it, until one day they were suddenly confronted with something no one could have imagined. 51 years of waiting. 51 years of searching for a child stolen from her mother's arms. And the question that started everything still lingers: if one day you open your front door, and your child had vanished without a trace, how would you live the next day, the next month, the next year? The story begins here. And it will not follow any rule you think you know about missing person cases. This is a journey where pain, love, and a miracle called science intertwine to rewrite the history of a family who once seemed broken beyond repair. In the early 1970s, Fort Worth, Texas still carried the look of a city in transition. Big roads coated with red dust. Neighborhoods woven between aging apartment complexes and small working-class homes. A place where neighbors exchanged simple nods, where children played outside without anyone imagining danger could be waiting behind the calm of an ordinary morning. Life was sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, but above all, it was real. Very real. In that picture was a young woman named Alta, just 22 years old. A single mother at an age when many other girls were still dreaming their own dreams. Alta didn't have that choice. She had Melissa, a 21-month-old little girl with bright eyes and a smile that could soften an entire room in a single second. Alta's life revolved around her child, working, paying rent, reminding herself every night that tomorrow she needed to be just a little stronger so her daughter could have a future that felt less uncertain. Alta had recently separated from her ex-husband, Jeffrey, not because they lacked love, but because life wasn't gentle enough for two young people trying to hold on while so much pressure weighed on their shoulders. They went their separate ways, but they still shared one thing: Melissa. And in that small apartment where the old fan hummed through the Texas summer nights, Alta did everything she could to make up for what life didn't give her daughter. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, a place where the smell of frying oil clung to her hair and her uniform, where every loose coin and tips had to be gathered carefully just to pay the babysitter. But babysitters were hard to find in those days. The 70s had no security cameras, no online profiles, no system to help a young mother feel safe when leaving her child with a stranger. Often, all Alta could do was hope that kindness still existed, that someone out there truly wanted to help. Sometimes, Alta would look at her sleeping daughter and feel something tender and aching rise inside her. Melissa was so innocent, so fragile, that Alta often wondered whether she was strong enough to protect her from the world. But life doesn't ask if you're ready, it unfolds regardless. And Alta, with her thin, determined hands, believed that if she tried hard enough, things would get better. Fort Worth back then wasn't a cruel city. But it was big enough to make a young woman feel small, busy enough for a child's cry to blend into the noise of traffic, and cold enough that, at times, Alta felt she was fighting alone. Yet every morning, when little Melissa stretched out her arms and wrapped them around her mother's neck, the exhaustion faded. Alta told herself that if she just kept moving forward, her daughter would someday live a better life. She had no way of knowing that those simple hopes would be shattered in a single morning. That one seemingly harmless decision would mark the beginning of a pain that would last a lifetime. But at that moment, She was simply a young mother trying to do the right thing in a world that wasn't always kind. And that's what makes this story even more heartbreaking, because it could have happened to anyone. And then, born from the worries of a young mother struggling to hold her life together, that seemingly harmless decision arrived. One late evening after a long shift, Alta sat at her small kitchen table, while the fan whirred and Melissa slept in her crib. She knew she couldn't keep relying on the goodwill of friends or neighbors. Her new job required longer hours, and next month's rent was coming fast. Alta needed a babysitter, someone steady, someone she could trust, even if only through a few short conversations. And in those days, when America still depended on newspapers to connect people, Alta did what thousands of young mothers did. She placed a tiny classified ad in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. A short, modest-line babysitter needed, weekday work. Call. At that moment, Alta had no reason to think that something so simple could alter the entire course of her life. She only believed she was doing the best she could for her daughter. A solution, a lifeline. Just a few days later, the phone rang in the small apartment. Alta picked up. On the other end was a woman's voice, low, gentle, polite. She introduced herself as Ruth Johnson. There was something calm in the way Ruth spoke, something that made Alta feel safe. Ruth said she had plenty of experience caring for children, that she lived in a spacious home with a large yard where kids could play. But what softened Alta the most was the way this woman asked about Melissa. How old she was, whether she liked music, whether she cried often. Her voice sounded like someone who had tended to many small children, patient, warm, familiar. Alta exhaled in relief. For the first time in months, she felt she might finally have someone she could rely on. Ruth arranged to meet her in person at the diner where Alta worked. Alta prepared everything, but Ruth never showed up. She called back later, apologizing with a voice full of guilt, saying she still wanted the job. Something unexpected had come up. She was terribly sorry. And somehow, with a strange kind of finesse, Ruth made Alta feel as if she were the one inconveniencing her. She reassured. She apologized. She was patient. And those were exactly the things a young mother, crushed under the weight of financial pressure, was vulnerable to. The second time Ruth called, Alta trusted her more. Not because of logic, but because of hope. Because she desperately needed someone to help. Because life was forcing her to place her trust in a stranger. Finally, after a few seconds of hesitant silence, Alta agreed to let Ruth pick Melissa up from Alta's roommate the next morning. What no one knew then was that the phone call, the gentle voice, and the name Ruth Johnson didn't exist in any record or directory in Fort Worth. No one knew that the kindness in her tone was a masked part of a carefully crafted plan. Alta only knew she was trying to be a mother, trying to survive, trying to give her daughter a better life. She didn't know that the moment she placed her trust in that unfamiliar voice, her fate was already shifting onto a road she would be forced to carry for the next half-century. The morning of August 23, 1971, began like any other summer morning in Fort Worth. The heat had already arrived the moment the sun came up. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that hits your face the moment you open the door. Alta left early for her morning shift. She kissed Melissa's forehead as the little girl stirred drowsily in her sleep, and told herself that maybe today everything would be okay. Ruth Johnson would come, work would go smoothly, all her efforts would finally pay off. Inside the small apartment, Alta's roommate prepared to wait for Ruth's arrival. It was a morning so normal, so peaceful, that no one could sense what was about to unfold. A morning calm enough that it was impossible to imagine how, in just a few minutes, a family's entire history would be torn apart. Around 9 a.m. there was a knock on the door. Soft, but clear. The roommate stepped over and opened it, and in that instant, she saw the woman Alta had described. But something felt wrong. Something subtle. Something that made the room seem to dim for half a second. The woman was dressed far too formally for a summer day in Texas, where the temperature had already passed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She wore long white gloves, a scarf around her neck, and a head covering that hid half her hair. Her clothes were completely covered, not at all suitable for the scorching heat outside. But she smiled softly, politely, as if nothing was unusual. Her voice was exactly as Alta had described, gentle, calm, enough to lower anyone's guard. The roommate hesitated for just a moment, not because she suspected anything, but because the outfit was too formal, almost like someone going to church, rather than someone coming to look after a child. But Ruth spoke with such confidence, such composure. She asked about Melissa. She praised how cute the baby was when she saw her laughing in someone's arms. Every word sounded sincere. And sometimes, just a bit of friendliness at the right moment is enough to break a person's instinct for self-protection. The roommate handed Melissa to Ruth, An action that took only a few seconds, but would later become a bitter memory she carried for the rest of her life. Ruth held the baby very expertly. She pulled Melissa close to her chest, patting her back lightly as if she had been caring for young children for years. No rush. No awkwardness. Nothing about her movements suggested she was hiding something. Before leaving, Ruth thanked her with a polite smile and stepped into the hallway. The morning sunlight streamed in, but she did not remove her gloves. She did not remove her scarf. She did not look back. Her steps were firm, even a bit leisurely, as if this encounter was only a very small part of a plan that had been carefully prepared long before. A few minutes later, when the sound of footsteps had faded at the end of the stairs, silence returned to the apartment. The roommate could not know that this moment would be the last time anyone in the family would see Melissa for the next 51 years. The details of the woman's appearance later became key points in the entire investigation. The white gloves on a day as hot as fire, the overly modest head covering, the clothes that revealed nothing about who she was. Everything seemed chosen to hide, to leave no trace, to become a ghost. But on that morning, no one noticed those signals. People saw politeness. They saw a seemingly kind woman. They saw someone Alta had said was trustworthy. And sometimes, kindness makes people underestimate danger. Perhaps the most heartbreaking image was the last one, Melissa turning her head back to smile as she was carried away. An innocent smile from a child who had no idea her life was about to be twisted in another direction. A smile Alta did not have the chance to see that morning. A smile that would become the only surviving memory in this tragic story. That afternoon, Alta got off work earlier than usual. The heat was still suffocating, but her heart felt a little lighter. She thought about Melissa, thinking the baby was probably playing with the new babysitter, maybe giggling with flushed cheeks because of the heat. A bit of hope slipped into Alta's heart. Hope that Ruth Johnson might be the answer to all the relentless worries of the past months. She walked faster as she approached the apartment complex. The thought of seeing her daughter made her steps quicken. Alta always imagined Melissa running to wrap her little arms around her legs or lifting her tiny hands asking to be carried. Just thinking about it made the entire long day feel worthwhile. But when Alta opened the door, nothing was as she expected. There was no babbling, no little footsteps pattering across the floor. Not a single sound suggesting Melissa was anywhere nearby. The room was so quiet that Alta felt as if she had stepped into a completely unfamiliar place. She called her daughter's name. Once, then again. Her voice was cheerful at first, then uncertain, then trembling. She walked into the bedroom. The crib was still open. The blanket she had folded that morning was still exactly where she left it. The unused bottle sat on the table. The toys lay still, as if no one had touched them in a long time. Alta felt her chest tighten, not out of immediate fear, but because of an unnameable wrongness. A feeling deeply instinctive, something only mothers truly know. A sense that something was not right, long before the mind could make sense of it. Her roommate stepped out, her face tense. She tried to explain that Ruth had arrived right on time, following Alta's instructions, and took Melissa calmly and politely. Everything had happened so smoothly that no one could have imagined what would come next. Alta froze. The words sounded distant, distorted, impossible. No arranged return time, no address, no instructions, no sign of when Ruth was supposed to bring Melissa back. Alta felt her stomach hollow out, as if someone had drained all the air from the apartment. She began asking questions rapidly. Where did Ruth go? Did she say anything? Did she leave a note? Was there anything strange? Her roommate shook her head, only feeding Alta's growing panic. And then panic turned into the most primal fear a mother can feel. Alta rushed out into the hallway, ran down the stairs, circled the apartment complex as if she moved fast enough she might catch sight of the woman carrying her daughter from behind some corner. But there was no one. No crying baby. No sign of Melissa. She ran back into the apartment, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. But she dialed anyway. She had to call the police. She had to do something. She had to cling to the tiny hope that this was all just a misunderstanding. When the line connected, Alta tried to stay calm enough to explain, but her voice kept breaking. Each word felt stuck somewhere between her throat and her pounding heart. Finally, she managed to force out one sentence that made the person on the other end go silent. My daughter is gone. Someone took her. Those words tore through the air of the already suffocatingly silent apartment. This was no longer a feeling, no longer a vague worry. It was a raw, brutal truth. A 21-month-old child had vanished from the very home where her mother believed she was safest. At that moment, Alta collapsed into a chair. She clenched her hands together until her knuckles turned pale. Tears fell, though she didn't notice. Only one question looped again and again in her mind. Why did I trust that voice? Why did I trust that woman? But the most painful part wasn't the regret, it was the horrifying realization that from this moment on, her life would never return to what it once was. And somewhere out there, the woman in white gloves was carrying her daughter into the vast, empty stretch of Texas. When the police arrived, Alta's small apartment quickly became the center of a barrage of questions. It had just passed 8 o'clock in the evening. The Texas sky had already darkened, and the pale yellow streetlights were beginning to spill their dim glow across the ground. But inside that apartment, the space felt as if it had shrunk, heavy, suffocating, difficult even to breathe in. The first 2 officers documented the situation. They looked around the room, taking in the empty crib, the toys still in place, the unused bottle. Everything was clean, orderly, and showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. A scene too perfect to be the result of a rushed kidnapping. That detail sent a chill not only through the officers, but through Alta herself. The roommate recounted every detail of the morning. How the woman with the white gloves stood at the door. How she spoke softly. How naturally she held Melissa, so naturally that nothing triggered any alarm. But the more she explained, the more guilt tightened inside her. Each time she described handing Melissa to a stranger, her voice wavered, as if she were confessing an unforgivable mistake. The officers tried to reassure the 2 women. But worry was unmistakable in their eyes. They asked Alta about the woman who called herself Ruth Johnson. Alta dug through her memory. Ruth had a soft southern accent. She sounded educated. She seemed genuinely interested in Melissa, but there was no address. No real last name. No paperwork. No clear description beyond her clothing and her voice. When police checked their records, they found no Ruth Johnson matching that description anywhere in Fort Worth. No babysitter registered under that name at any center or church. No phone number. No place of residence. No trace left behind from any of the previous calls. Only a name, one that may never have been real in the first place. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer the truth became. This woman wasn't some babysitter casually looking for work. She was someone who had planned every detail, someone who deliberately concealed all identifiable features with gloves, a headscarf, and an overly polite demeanor. She hadn't come to ask for a job. She had come to take a child. But at that moment, something even harder than finding the kidnapper awaited the officers, convincing Alta that none of this was her fault. Every investigator knew that in cases involving missing children, parental guilt was often the heaviest weight. Alta sat there with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes red and swollen. Each time she remembered Ruth's voice, her fingers tightened more. As night fell, officers began canvassing the area around the apartment complex. They knocked on every door, asking if anyone had seen a woman carrying a small child. But no one recalled anything. In the blistering heat of a summer day, too many people had come and gone. No one paid attention to a woman dressed as if she were on her way to church. No one imagined something this tragic could have happened. The search kept expanding. They checked bus stations, taxi stands, questioned long-haul drivers. But everything seemed to fall into a void. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. No sign that Melissa had been placed in a vehicle or taken out of the neighborhood. It was as if the woman had vanished with the little girl in broad daylight. When the case was handed over to the FBI, they encountered the same obstacles. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no accurate identifying information. A kidnapping executed too neatly, too cleanly, too calmly. So much so that many investigators had to admit that from the very beginning, they had been chasing a ghost. Alta followed every development. Each time the phone rang, she rushed to it, as if it might finally be news about her daughter. But every time, it was just new questions, new forms, or promises even the police themselves didn't dare believe in. She began staying up all night, pacing the apartment, staring at the empty crib as though if she tried hard enough, Melissa might reappear. But no miracle came. No tiny footsteps running toward her. No bright, bubbling laughter. Only the thick silence hanging over the room like fog. A silence so deep that Alta could hear her own heartbeat, and feel each beat cracking inside her. An older investigator looked at Alta and told her they wouldn't give up. But even he knew that cases like this rarely had happy endings. And as that night drew to a close, Fort Worth seemed to stretch into an endless space capable of swallowing every trace of a small child. The case had begun with a question no one wanted to confront. And now, it revealed an even more painful truth: sometimes kidnappers don't run. They simply disappear into the very normalcy of society. And that made the search even more desperate. In the first few days after the disappearance, Fort Worth seemed to hold its breath. The local newspaper printed Melissa's photo on the front page. The evening news mentioned the case. Residents whispered about the woman with the white gloves. Officers moved constantly through the hallways. Every knock on a door carried both hope and fear. But like every media storm, public attention gradually faded. New stories appeared. Fresh headlines pushed their way in. And the disappearance of a 21-month-old girl slowly sank beneath the endless flow of daily news. But not for Alta. For her, time did not move. It remained frozen at the moment she opened the door to an empty room. She kept living, kept breathing, kept working, but inside her was a private room of its own. A cold, dark room that echoed her daughter's name again and again. She woke up each morning not because she wanted to, but because her body forced her to. There were days she realized she had been standing for hours beside the crib, touching the wooden bars as if they still held Melissa's warmth. Police calls became less frequent. Searches narrowed. The few leads they had went nowhere. They told her the case wasn't closed. They told her the file was still active. But Alta understood the language hidden between those words. The case had gone cold, not because they didn't care, but because there was nothing left to pursue. No evidence, no testimony, no direction. And in the quietest moments, Alta felt as if she were losing Melissa for the second time. The first was the morning Ruth walked away with her. The second was when the world began to forget. There is nothing more frightening for a mother than realizing that the pain she carries every single day has become an old story to everyone else. Alta was trapped between two worlds. One was the real world, where she had to pay rent, keep working, and show up in front of people as if she were fine. The other was the world in her mind, where she replayed that day over and over, every detail, every moment, every sound. In that world she kept wondering whether Melissa cried, whether the little girl was scared, whether the woman treated her gently or cruelly. Those questions would never have answers. But they were enough to pull Alta to the bottom of despair. Some nights she sat on her bed, clutching the tiny shirt Melissa used to wear, breathing in the scent of milk and soap like it was the only way to keep her daughter close. Some days she couldn't work at all, because just seeing a child in a cafe made her chest tighten. She started blaming herself, blaming that newspaper ad, the phone call, and the trust she placed in a stranger. Her friends tried to comfort her. They said it wasn't her fault. They said anyone in her situation would have done the same. But words couldn't reach the deepest corners of a mother's grief. Alta still heard another voice inside her. She was the one who failed to protect her child. She was the one who let Melissa slip out of her arms. That year, Alta quit her job for a while. She couldn't wait tables or force a polite smile when her heart felt torn apart every hour of the day. She began going everywhere, asking anyone who might know something. Every week she went to the police station to ask about updates. She kept every newspaper, every flyer, every broadcast mentioning Melissa as if they were the last remaining pieces of her daughter. But the cruelest part wasn't the silence. It was the false tips. Someone would say they saw a child who looked like Melissa in a supermarket. Someone else claimed they saw a dark-haired little girl in a stranger's car. Alta rushed out immediately. There were times she drove for hours only to realize the child wasn't Melissa. Then she returned to her empty apartment, holding the disappointment like a wound that never healed. The city slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But for Alta, every day felt the same. Each day was a reminder that her daughter was somewhere out there, no one knew in what condition, and she was powerless. When winter arrived, Fort Worth was colder than usual. But inside Alta, that cold had settled long before. The case was officially labeled as having no progress. The files grew thinner. Detectives changed shifts. And Melissa became one of the many missing children of that decade. But to Alta, she was still her entire world. And that world had vanished right before her eyes, leaving not even a single footprint behind. Time kept moving, but for Alta and her family, each passing year felt like another layer of dust settling on a pain already too heavy to bear. The 80s came and went. The 90s followed quietly, and the disappearance of Melissa Highsmith became one of Fort Worth's oldest unsolved cases, opened and closed, read and stored away, always remembered but never moving forward. But for Alta's family, time didn't fade Melissa. It only made the longing more persistent. On every birthday, Alta placed a small cake on the table, lit a single candle, and whispered a prayer. She didn't know what her daughter looked like anymore, how tall she was, what her smile had become. But she believed that somewhere out there, Melissa was still alive. That belief didn't come from logic. It came from the instinct of a mother who had lost too much to ever let go. In the years that followed, age progression technology began to emerge. Newspapers and child protection organizations released drawings showing what Melissa might look like at 13, 18, 2005. Every time she saw those images, Alta felt her heart stumble. She tried to match those unfamiliar features to the round little face her daughter once had. But time is a cruel artist. It changes everything, And what Alta feared most was that she might not recognize Melissa if she were standing right in front of her. Each updated image brought another wave of phone calls. Someone claimed they had seen a girl who looked like Melissa in a convenience store in Oklahoma. Someone else said they met a young woman whose eyes looked just like the drawing. No matter how vague the tip was, Alta followed it. She drove across state lines. She stood in unfamiliar neighborhoods, searching every passing face with the fragile hope that this time would be different. But it was always disappointment. The girls who were reported never turned out to be Melissa. Even the smallest sparks of hope shattered within minutes. And then Alta returned home, holding her sadness the way someone holds an old piece of clothing. Exhausted, but unable to let it go. The whole family grew older, but Melissa's story remained present at every gathering, every conversation. Her siblings grew up with a quiet emptiness, knowing they had a sister they had never met. They listened to their mother retell every detail of that fateful day. They heard the story so often they could recite it, and each of them carried the same question: where is she? 3 decades of searching brought no answers. But it didn't take away their hope. Because if Alta ever let go of that hope, it would mean losing Melissa all over again. And she couldn't survive that. The pain never left during those 30 years. It only changed shape from a violent storm into a slow, quiet current. But within that current, a small light of hope still remained. Hope that one day, even in the most ordinary moment, someone might recognize Melissa. Or that Melissa might recognize herself. And what Alta never expected was that this hope, fragile enough to almost go out, was slowly moving closer. Closer than ever. As the world stepped into the 2000s, something new entered people's lives. The internet was no longer a distant thing in labs or big offices. It became part of everyday life, appearing in homes, cafes, and classrooms. And for Alta's family, it opened a door they had lived without for 3 decades. A place to speak, a place to ask, a place to hope. Alta's children, now grown, had lived their entire lives with the story of their missing sister. They understood that the pain didn't belong only to their mother, it belonged to the whole family. And they were the first to say that it was time to try something new. Not relying only on newspapers. Not just waiting on the police. Not depending on lifeless sketches. They believed that the vast world online might succeed where 30 years of traditional methods had failed. That year, they created a Facebook page. A simple page, but one that carried an entire universe of emotion. Its name was Finding Melissa Highsmith. Just 4 words, but to the family, it felt like a new vow. A promise that the journey would not end just because time had stretched on for so long. They uploaded every photo they still had. The picture of Melissa grinning with a little bow in her hair. The picture of Alta at 22, her eyes full of hope like any young mother. They posted the story, detail by detail, as if every sentence was its own small search. Not to retell the past, but to send it into the future to reach someone, somewhere, who might scroll past and recognize something familiar. People online began to pay attention. Strangers from other states, other countries, shared the page. They didn't know Alta. They didn't know Melissa. But they understood the feeling of loss. They understood that no family should have to spend 30 years searching for a child who once fit perfectly in their arms. The Facebook page slowly became more than a search tool, it became a place of healing. Alta read every comment, every message of support. Some sent prayers. Some shared their own stories, because they too were searching for a child, a father, a mother. That empathy made Alta feel, for the first time in years, that she wasn't completely alone. The age-progressed images of Melissa were updated regularly. Every time a new version came out, the family posted it, hoping that face would reach the right person. They knew Melissa might not look like the sketch, but they also knew the internet has eyes. Communities have memory. One share to the right person could change everything. And among the thousands of posts sent out into social media every day, the story of the little girl kidnapped in 1971 became a small but persistent streak of light. Not loud, not powerful, but steady. It never faded, because behind it was 3 decades of pain and the unwavering persistence of a family unwilling to give up. Alta wasn't tech-savvy. She didn't know how to use complex features. But every night she opened that Facebook page, stared at Melissa's pictures, read the comments, and whispered her prayer. Her dream was no longer held only by the police or the newspapers. It was now held by thousands of strangers, people who believed the internet could bring someone home. And what Alta didn't know was that this very platform, this small Facebook page, would become an essential part of the chain of events that would bring Melissa back to her family. Not quickly, not easily. But with every post, every share, they were moving closer to what once seemed impossible. In 2022, when the family had grown used to the quiet years passing by, an unexpected lead surfaced. A call came in to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A stranger in Charleston, South Carolina said they had seen a woman who looked exactly like the age-progressed sketch of Melissa at 50. Not just a little similar, so strikingly similar that the person stopped, stared, and decided to report it immediately. When the information reached the family, their hearts tightened. They were used to disappointment, used to hoping and losing. But this time felt different. The description was more detailed. The woman had a feature that strongly matched the sketch. And more than anything, her age lined up in a way that felt uncanny. Alta's hands trembled as she heard the news. She had endured too many heartbreaks. But at 70 years old, even the smallest glimmer of light was enough to make her heart come alive again. She said just one simple, choked sentence: "I want to go. I need to see for myself." Only a few days later, the family rearranged everything, gathered money, and booked plane tickets. They weren't wealthy. But they had spent more than this before chasing even smaller hopes. They flew to Charleston as if racing against time, against fate, against 40 stolen years. When they arrived, they started searching. They put up flyers. They went to the neighborhood the caller had described. They spoke with neighbors, with store owners, with security guards at the apartment complex. Every face that passed, every middle-aged woman, made them hold their breath for a moment. And then one day, they found the woman. She looked at them in confusion as they showed her the sketch and explained the story. She said she was willing to take a DNA test to be sure. The family's hearts seemed to collapse into a single moment. They had reached this point many times before, and each time had been an emotional battlefield. Alta stood there, studying the woman, searching for something familiar, a feature, an expression, a mother's instinct. She wanted to believe, but at the same time, she feared that believing might break her heart all over again. The test was done, and then they waited. A week that felt like a year. Every morning, Alta opened the Finding Melissa Facebook page, stared at her daughter's baby photos, and whispered, "Please, let it be this time." But then the results came back. No biological relation. Not Melissa. When Alta heard the news, she didn't cry right away. She simply sat down, silent. And that silence hurt the family more than any sob could. Because they knew that every shattered hope was another piece of their mother slowly dying. Alta's daughter wrapped her arms around her. "You still have us, Mom." But Alta just shook her head softly. "You were never taken from my arms." That sentence filled the room with a sadness no one knew how to ease. The Charleston trip ended like so many journeys they had made before: hope, anticipation, then heartbreak. But this time, something felt different. This time, they sensed that time was no longer on their side. Melissa might be living another life. Or she might no longer be alive at all. No one knew. And that not knowing was the thing that tormented Alta more than any truth could. But just when every last bit of hope seemed to be fading, another idea began to form in Jeffrey's mind. A small idea, simple. Something that didn't even seem related to an investigation at all. A family DNA test. One tiny vial of saliva. One fragile chance. And that idea would become the greatest turning point of their entire lives. After the trip to Charleston, after that hope shattered yet again, the family returned to Texas in a heavy silence. Alta slept in short, restless stretches, and Jeffrey spent many nights wide awake. The man who had endured quietly for 50 years suddenly felt something with absolute clarity. If they didn't find Melissa now, then when? Time was no longer patient with them. One evening, Jeffrey sat in front of the computer, scrolling through hundreds of comments on the Finding Melissa page. Someone wrote that they had located their biological father through a DNA test. Another person said they found siblings lost for decades. One comment read, "I don't know where Melissa is, but DNA brought me back to my family." Jeffrey stopped there for a long time. He had never placed much faith in technology. He came from a generation that trusted police, trusted witnesses, trusted instinct. But none of those things had brought Melissa home in nearly half a century. So why not try what this new era was handing them now? A small tool, a bit of saliva, a chance built on science instead of fragile hope. That night, Jeffrey told his ex-wife during a late phone call. He said he wanted to try something new. Alta asked what it was. "DNA," he said quietly. "A kit you can buy online. We just send in a sample and wait." Alta was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "If there's even a 1 in a million chance, we still have to try." Their children agreed instantly when they heard. They had grown up with that loss. They knew better than anyone that this was no longer a case for the police. This was a story for science, for family, for people who refused to give up. Jeffrey ordered the kit on a windy afternoon. When the small box arrived on the doorstep, he held it as if it were something sacred. Not because it was expensive, but because it carried a hope no one dared speak out loud. Just one more time. Just one more try. He opened the box and followed the instructions. One saliva sample, one envelope to mail, one tracking number on a screen. Inside him was a strange feeling, not quite hope, not quite fear, a quiet peace. Because for the first time in many years, he felt like he was moving forward instead of standing still. When he dropped the envelope off at the post office, Jeffrey stood for a long time in front of the glass doors. He thought about Melissa's tiny feet, her baby smile, the days he believed he didn't deserve to be a father because he couldn't protect his child. He whispered, "Melissa, if you're still out there somewhere, please let me find you." The family didn't talk much about the test. They were afraid of planting hope only to break themselves again. But each of them quietly checked their email every single day. Some nights, Alta sat alone, staring at her phone screen like she was waiting for a miracle. Then one completely ordinary morning, as the Texas sun cast a soft golden light through the window, Jeffrey's phone buzzed. A notification from the DNA company. The results were ready. He took a deep breath, his hands trembled. He opened the email, and the moment that line appeared on the screen, everything he had known for 50 years changed. DNA match found. Direct match. A direct match meant child, but the name on the report wasn't Melissa. There were 3 names. 3 grown adults. No one had prepared for that. No one had even considered the possibility. Jeffrey stared at the screen, trying to understand what science was telling him. If those 3 people were his biological grandchildren, then their mother had to be Melissa. The moment Jeffrey saw the words DNA match found, his heart felt like it stopped for one long, suspended second. The screen glowed in front of him, but his eyes blurred not from age, not from the light, but from something else. A feeling that was part hope, part fear. A feeling he hadn't dared to touch in almost half a century. The results did not show Melissa's name. They showed 3 completely unfamiliar ones. 3 adults. 3 genetic profiles that matched him down to the smallest markers. Not distant relatives. Not random coincidences. They carried his DNA. That could only happen if they were his biological grandchildren. And for that to be true, there was only one possible explanation. Their mother had to be Melissa. Jeffrey sat frozen for a long moment. He reread every line, every number, every piece of scientific confirmation, as if misreading even a single letter might cause all of it to vanish. But the result stayed there. Clear. Plain. Emotionless yet powerful enough to shift the course of his entire life. He called his eldest daughter. His voice shook so much he could barely speak a few words. The results came in. They hurried to open the report, examining every detail. And when they saw the usernames of Melissa's 3 children, all of them fell silent at the exact same time. No one dared say out loud what was hovering in their minds. No one wanted to shatter that fragile, impossible moment. A moment too delicate to touch. Finally, his daughter whispered, "Dad, if this is real, it means she's alive. It means she had kids. It means she's still somewhere out there." Alta was notified afterward. When she heard the word grandchildren, she put a hand over her mouth, as if the whole world had tilted in front of her. For 51 years, she had prayed for her daughter to be alive. But she had never once dared to imagine that Melissa might have become a mother. An adult with a life of her own. Alta's tears didn't fall from pain, but from an emotion she had forgotten for many years: joy. A kind of joy she didn't dare express out loud, afraid it would vanish if she breathed too hard. She whispered through sobs, "My God, she's alive. She grew up." But that joy quickly merged with a much bigger question. Who was the mother of those 3 children? What name had she been living under? And did she even know that she was the kidnapped Melissa from all those years ago? The family began digging through every piece of data the DNA company allowed. DNA profiles let them send internal messages, not enough to reveal personal details, but enough to open a very small door. Jeffrey typed a short line, "I believe I am closely related to you. Please contact me." Then they waited. 1 day, 2 days, a week. No one replied. But the path had already opened. DNA had spoken on behalf of decades of silence. It was no longer a theory, no longer vague hints. Science had delivered what police, newspapers, and even time itself had failed to bring back. That first night after learning the truth, Jeffrey sat alone in the living room. He looked up at the photo of little Melissa, the same picture Alta had kept in her wallet for half a century. For the first time, he dared touch the tiny face in the photo with his trembling fingers. He whispered, "Daughter, let me find you for the rest of the way." And he knew that somewhere in this vast city, a grown woman was living a life completely separate from the truth of who she really was. A woman who, in just a few days after just a few more attempts to reach her, would have her entire world turned upside down. The name she had carried for more than 50 years would soon collide with the truth. She was not Melanie Walden. She was Melissa Highsmith. After many silent days of waiting, the Highsmith family finally found a way to trace the person behind the DNA profiles. A name surfaced through public data, one small lead, one tiny marker that connected all the pieces. Her name was Melanie Walden. The age matched. The location matched. And most importantly, every DNA indicator pointed straight to her. Jeffrey sat in front of his Facebook screen for a long time, the blinking cursor in the message box urging him forward. He had never had to write anything so difficult. How do you tell someone that the life they know might not be the life they were meant to live? How do you tell a grown woman that you believe she is the child who went missing 50 years ago? But in the end, he had to send it, because this might be the only chance. He typed slowly, no embellishment, no long explanations, just the truth raw and trembling. My name is Jeffrey Highsmith. I believe I may be your biological father. My daughter went missing in 1971, and DNA suggests you might be her. He reread the message once, then twice. Then he pressed send. When the small Facebook ping sounded, his heart tightened. From that moment on, everything was out of his hands. Across the screen, in a city not far away, Melanie received the message late in the evening. She was sitting in her living room when her phone lit up with a notification from a stranger. When she read the first few lines, she frowned, assuming it had to be a scam. Social media was full of strange stories like that: a random man claiming to be your father, a kidnapped child, a DNA match. She set her phone down and shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she said to her husband. "Someone online thinks I'm some missing kid from years ago." She laughed, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes. Her husband didn't laugh. He sensed something different in the message. It didn't sound like spam. No requests for money. No weird links. Just a man talking about a lost daughter. He opened his laptop and typed Melissa Highsmith into the search bar. Instantly, dozens of articles, photos, and videos appeared: old photographs, flyers, decades of interviews from the Highsmith family. As he scrolled, one picture made him stop. A little girl with dark hair, round eyes, and chubby cheeks. He called Melanie over. "Look at this." Melanie leaned down, at first glancing out of politeness. But only a few seconds later, her expression changed. The eyes in that photo, the tiny mouth, the faint birthmark under the left eye. Everything resembled her in a way she couldn't explain. The room fell silent. Melanie covered her mouth with her hand. She couldn't say anything, not because she believed, not because she didn't believe, but because something in that image felt like it had cracked open her entire life. She remembered pieces of her childhood, things that never had explanations, restrictive rules, stories that didn't line up about the day she was born, evasive answers whenever she asked about her biological parents. Everything she had pushed aside suddenly rushed back. Melanie turned to her husband, her voice trembling. What if that really is me?" The question hung in the air, like a door just beginning to open. After a few hours of thinking, she opened Jeffrey's message again. This time she didn't skim. She read every word carefully. Then she hit reply. Just one short line. One sentence that could change everything. "I don't know what to think. But we can talk." When that message appeared on Jeffrey's screen, he put a hand to his chest as if to hold his heart in place. After 51 years, he had received the first reply from the person who might be the small child he had lost. And from that moment, the truth began moving toward them more quickly than ever. After Melanie answered, the Highsmith family held their breath. No one dared celebrate too soon. No one wanted to speak aloud what their hearts were shouting. They had touched hope before and watched it vanish. This time they needed certainty, not feelings, not hunches, but undeniable scientific truth. Jeffrey sent Melanie information for an independent laboratory, not a commercial test, not an online database, but a legally admissible test performed by genomic experts. He wrote briefly, "We only need to know the truth. Whatever the result, I will respect it." Melanie read that message many times. Her hand trembled. She had grown up with a persistent sense that she didn't belong, but she had never dared dig into that suspicion. It was too frightening, too vast, too difficult to touch. Now, with the possibility of the truth before her, she felt she could no longer step back. She had to know who she was. One morning she went to the lab. The smell of disinfectant was cold. The fluorescent lights were sharp. The technician smiled and handed her a kit. A single cotton swab brushed inside her cheek, an ordinary gesture. But her hand shook, because she knew those few seconds could rewrite her entire life. When the sample was sealed, Melanie looked at the envelope as if it were a future she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. She whispered to herself, "If this is true, it means part of my life was taken. But it also means I have a family that has been searching for me for more than half a century." In Texas, Alta sat beside the phone, watching the minutes pass. She knew the test could bring the greatest joy or the deepest heartbreak of her life. Still she waited, because being a mother means waiting. For a week. For a month. For a lifetime, Jeffrey tried to appear strong, but each night he opened his phone to stare at Melissa's baby photos. He laid a trembling hand over the small face in the picture as if trying to touch a memory. He whispered, "Please, let me find you." The days waiting for results stretched on like the years before. Every hour felt like a replay of all they had endured: hopeless trips, false leads, sleepless nights. But this time there was something different, a clear sense that the truth was nearer than it had ever been. And then, that fateful morning finally arrived. The lab sent an email. Just one simple line. "The results are ready." Jeffrey opened the email. Alta stood behind him, her hand gripping the chair to keep herself from collapsing. Their daughters stood on both sides of them, holding their breath so tightly they couldn't even hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. When Jeffrey scrolled down to see the results, his eyes widened, then turned red. He had to blink several times just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. And then he spoke, his voice breaking, half crying, half laughing. "It's her. The DNA is a full match. This is Melissa." Alta brought her hand to her mouth and burst into tears like a child. They weren't tears of pain. They were the tears of a heart that had been waiting far too long and was finally set free. She whispered, "My daughter, you're alive." Somewhere else, Melanie received the same email. When she read the confirmation, her knees gave out. She wasn't the person she thought she'd been 52 years. She was the missing child, the little girl the whole country once searched for. The daughter of a family who never stopped loving her. And from that moment on, none of them could ever return to the lives they had before. That Thanksgiving arrived for the Highsmith family like a miracle they still barely dared to believe. Texas in late November was crisp and cool, the sky clear and strangely peaceful, but inside Alta and Jeffrey, everything trembled as if about to shatter. Because in just a few hours, they would stand face to face with the daughter who had been gone from their arms for 51 years. A relative's home was chosen as the meeting place. A small, warm house filled with laughter and voices as the family prepared for a gathering they had never imagined they would one day get to experience. Children carried pies into the kitchen. Adults arranged tables and chairs. But every time there was a sound near the window, everyone froze and looked outside as if the moment might arrive earlier than expected. Alta sat in a corner, her hands clasped tightly together. She had lived through hundreds of different versions of hope over the years. Hope that her daughter was alive, hope that she wasn't suffering, hope that they would find her before it was too late. And now, that hope was right outside the door. Just a few steps away. Jeffrey stood by the window, trying to appear calm, though his heart pounded like a drum. A man who had lived through half a century of loss, guilt, and waiting was now as anxious as a child about to receive the greatest gift of his life. He didn't know how he would react when he finally saw his daughter. He just knew he would recognize her no matter how much time had changed. Then a car slowly pulled into the driveway. A nephew saw it first and shouted, "They're here!" The whole room seemed to stop breathing. Alta shot to her feet. Jeffrey held the back of the chair to steady himself. No one spoke. No one dared. They all just stared at the door. When it opened, Melanie stepped inside. She stood there, a grown woman, her eyes filled with emotions no words could ever capture. She didn't look exactly like the sketches. She didn't look like the child from years ago. But something in her eyes made Alta break into tears instantly. In that moment, there was no need for a test. No need for paperwork. No need for any official confirmation. A mother always knows her child. Alta walked forward slowly. Each step carried the weight of 50 years on her shoulders. She didn't say a word. Melanie didn't either. And then when the two stood face to face, Alta lifted her hand and gently touched Melanie's cheek, her fingers trembling as if she were afraid the dream would disappear. She whispered just one small sentence. "My daughter." Melanie broke down. Not the kind of crying born from pain, but the kind that comes from a life finally discovering where it truly began. She wrapped her arms around Alta, holding her as if trying to make up for all the years that were stolen. Alta held her back, clutching her as though she were holding her own youth, her sorrow, and the miracle she never thought she would live long enough to see. Jeffrey stepped forward next, his eyes red and shining. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He reached out his hand, his voice rough and breaking. "It's Dad, Melissa. It's Dad." Melanie turned toward him, and in that embrace, the man who once believed he had lost everything felt his heart mend after half a century of cracks. The room erupted. Applause, sobs, laughter tangled with tears. No one tried to hide what they felt. No one was embarrassed to cry. Because on that day, the Highsmith family witnessed something most families only dare pray for. They found their child again. Food was set out on the table, but no one cared about it. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Melanie. They asked questions. They laughed. They shared stories, pieces of a life she never knew she was missing. And Melanie listened to everything, sometimes glancing at Alta or Jeffrey, just to make sure they were truly there, that this wasn't some fleeting dream. As the afternoon drifted into evening, the warm yellow light inside the house shone softly on the faces of the three standing together. A family torn apart by a cruel act, reunited by science, perseverance, and a love that refused to die. That night, Alta whispered through trembling breath, "Thank you for coming back to me. Thank you for being alive." And Melanie answered with a simple sentence, one as beautiful as a prayer. "I've always belonged here. I've always belonged to this family." In the warm glow of Thanksgiving, the Highsmiths finally received what they had been sending into the universe for 51 years, an answer, a returned child, and a miracle no one could ever erase. After the reunion, when the joy settled like a lake calming after a gust of wind, Melanie began facing something she had never touched in her entire life. The truth. Not a gentle truth. Not a truth you hear once and can simply move on from, but a truth heavy enough to shake every memory she had ever held. For 51 years, Melanie believed she had grown up in a normal family, an unhappy one, but normal. The woman who raised her had always been overly protective, always controlling, always wrapping her in invisible bindings that her childhood self had no words to describe. She remembered days when she was locked inside the house for no reason. She remembered not being allowed to play with other children. She remembered strange warnings, "You can't go outside. Don't tell anyone about what happens in this house. You were born premature, so you can't let people touch you." Those words, when she was little, were just rules. But now, they were pieces of a secret the woman had spent a lifetime hiding. When Melanie shared her childhood with Alta and Jeffrey, the small room seemed to sink under the weight of it. Alta held her daughter's hand, her heart tightening as if someone were squeezing it. She had feared Melissa might have died, but she had never imagined her child had lived without a childhood. Lived without freedom. Lived without being truly loved. Melanie spoke softly, but every word seemed to cut into the air. "She used to say I was injured at birth, that I was weak, that I couldn't leave her. I believed that my entire childhood." Alta turned away to hide her tears. She had imagined thousands of possibilities, but she had never imagined her daughter growing up in fear. Then Melanie told them the part that made Jeffrey clench his fists. As she got older, she realized the woman wasn't her biological mother. But every time she asked, every time she brought up paperwork, the answer was either a threat or silence. "I tried to run away once," she said. "I was 15. She beat me. After that, I never asked again." Jeffrey had to look out the window because he was afraid he would cry in front of his daughter. The man who had blamed himself for half a lifetime now understood. Melissa hadn't just been taken from her family. She had been robbed of the gentle, warm, safe life she was supposed to have. Melanie went on to explain that as an adult, she started questioning more things. There was no official birth certificate. No one in that household ever talked about the day she was born. There were no photos of her at 3, at 4. It was as if she hadn't existed before a certain point in time. And then she told them about the moment she confronted the woman who raised her after she learned the DNA results. A conversation no one in the Highsmith family could have imagined. "She didn't cry," Melanie said. "She didn't apologize. She just said one thing that froze my blood. I always knew you weren't my child." No explanation. No reason. Not a drop of remorse. In the family meeting room that day, when Melanie repeated those words, Alta pressed a hand to her chest as if her heart had just been crushed. A real mother would never say something like that. Melanie lowered her head, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who I was for so many years. And now that I do, I don't know how to feel." Alta pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her like she was reclaiming the child she had spent a lifetime searching for. She whispered, "You were loved from the very first day. Nothing can take that away. No one can take your childhood from you, even if they tried." And in that moment, the truth, painful as it was, became part of the healing. Because finally, Melanie knew where she came from. She knew she was not born in darkness. She was born in love. A love that had crossed 51 years to find its way back to her. After the reunion, once the tears had been wiped away and the embraces stopped trembling, Melanie began another journey. A journey with no map, no instructions, and one that was sometimes even more frightening than finding her family. It was the journey back to herself. For 51 years, she had lived with a name that had never belonged to her. Melanie Walden. A name that, every time someone called it, made her feel a little out of place, as if it were a coat someone else had put on her. Ill-fitting. Incorrect. Not real. When the truth was fully confirmed, the Highsmith family didn't pressure her to change anything. They only told her she had the right to decide who she would be from this day forward. But it was Melanie who felt the need to clarify that first, not for the world, but for herself. She began therapy right after the reunion. In her first session, when asked, "Who do you think you are?" Melanie stayed silent for a long time. She didn't know how to answer. She had lived half her life under control, half in fear, and the rest in unanswered questions. Now, faced with the truth, she felt both lighter and emptier. In another session, she said something that made the entire Highsmith family cry when they heard it later. "I don't know what I lost. Because I have nothing to compare it to. I only know I was missing something for decades. And now I finally know what that missing piece was." Experts called it an identity trauma, when someone is denied ownership of their own life. But Melanie called it something much simpler. She said, "I'm learning how to become myself." Alta sat beside her in many therapy sessions, holding her hand as if holding on to the years she had once lost. Jeffrey would always tell her something she never forgot: "You don't need to become someone new. You just need to return to the person you already were when you left our arms." And then, naturally, Melanie made a big decision. She wanted her name back. Her real name. The name Alta had whispered into her ear, the day she came into the world: Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The day she went to court, the whole family came with her. The courtroom was small, the lights slightly yellow, the air still as if witnessing something sacred. When the judge read the final line, "The court officially recognizes your legal name as Melissa Suzanne Highsmith," Alta burst into tears. Jeffrey bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with relief. And she, the woman who had lived her entire life under someone else's name, smiled through her tears. Melissa. Hearing someone call her that for the first time, she felt a calmness rise from her chest to her throat. Not because the name was beautiful, but because it was right. It belonged to her, and she belonged to it. She began keeping a journal. Simple lines: "Today I practiced saying my name. Today I looked in the mirror and saw a part of Melissa in my eyes. Today I feel less lost than before." She also did something no one in the family expected. She went to her 3 children and told them the truth. Not to shock them, but so they would understand that everything they thought they knew about her origins was only part of the story. They hugged her and told her they were proud she had survived all of it. She had never felt relief like she did in that moment. Melissa also began doing something she had never dared to do when she was still Melanie. She went out more. She connected with relatives. She attended family gatherings. She laughed more. A real laugh, not the kind you wear to look like you're fine. Once, Alta asked her daughter, "Do you feel like you've found yourself again?" Melissa held her hand and replied, "I didn't just find myself. I'm living for the first time." Her healing journey was not easy. There were nights she still startled awake from childhood memories. There were moments when she felt herself being pulled back into the old darkness. But each time, she reminded herself that she was no longer alone. She had family. She had the truth. She had her real name. And most importantly, she had a future that for the first time in her life she was allowed to choose. After Melissa returned, the Highsmith family did not just get a daughter back. They found again the very reason they had never given up through 51 long years. And strangely, their story, one that began with loss, became a guiding light for many others. News of the reunion spread across America. From local newspapers to national television shows, everyone talked about the miracle of DNA. Everyone mentioned the longest journey a family could ever endure. But what moved people was not just the result, it was the way this family held on to hope even when every door seemed closed. Alta became the face many mothers reached out to. They spoke to her through social media, through handwritten letters, sometimes through long phone calls filled with tears. They said they too were searching for their children. They too were living in an endless wait. And Alta, with a gentle voice softened by time, always said the same thing: "If I found my child after 51 years, then no journey is ever too late." Jeffrey became a voice for fathers who had silently carried their grief. He went to community meetings, sharing about DNA, about technology, about never assuming tomorrow will be the same as today. He often said, "Science brought my daughter back. But faith kept me alive long enough to see it happen." Their children took over the Finding Melissa Highsmith page and turned it into a hub for people searching for loved ones through genetic genealogy. They guided others on how to upload DNA data, how to contact experts, how to read genetic matches. And most importantly, they offered everyone a reminder that families are never truly lost as long as someone is still searching. And Melissa, the woman who lost her entire childhood, became the most powerful source of inspiration. She spoke with people who grew up with hidden identities. She shared about therapy, about rebuilding the self, about accepting pain without letting it define you. Once, on a small stage at a gathering for identity theft survivors, she said, "I am not a miracle. I'm only proof that the truth always finds its way home." That sentence spread like a warm flame. The Highsmith family was also invited to scientific conferences to share their story not just as a touching case, but as a clear example of the power of community-based genetic research. 1.